My name is Brenda Collins. I'm 26 years old, and I never thought I would end up lying on a hospital bed, listening to a doctor tell me that someone had been slowly making me sick for weeks. It started the night I collapsed on the kitchen floor. At first, everyone said it was stress. I had just come back to that house after 5 years away, a place where I was never really wanted, never treated like I belonged. So, when I started feeling weak, dizzy, unable to focus, I told myself it was just the pressure of being back around people who had already decided who I was a long time ago. But that night, halfway through dinner, everything went wrong. My hands stopped working, my vision blurred, and the room tilted like it was slipping away from me. I remember someone calling my name, then nothing. When I woke up, the lights were too bright, the air felt and everyone was staring at me like I had almost disappeared. The doctor didn't say it right away. He waited until we were alone. Then he looked at me and said something that made my entire body go cold. This wasn't an accident. There was something in my system, not once, not all at once. Someone had been doing this to me. Slowly, for weeks. And when I finally found out who it was, I couldn't breathe, not because I was surprised, but because deep down, I think a part of me had always known. Before we go any further, tell me what time it is where you're watching from, and which city you're in. I want to see just how far this story reaches. And if you've ever felt like the people closest to you weren't really on your side, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts below. Because this story might hit closer than you expect. The next morning, the hospital room felt quieter than it should have. Brenda opened her eyes slowly, her body still heavy, her thoughts clearer than before, and the first thing she noticed was the way everyone was standing around her bed, not speaking, just watching. Her stepmother was closest, holding her hand too tightly as if trying to prove something. Her eyes red, but her expression controlled. Her father stood a little further back, arms crossed, his face unreadable, not worried, not relieved, just distant. Her sister was near the window, silent, composed, the same calm presence that had always filled every room before Brenda ever walked into it. No one spoke first, and that silence pressed down harder than any words could. Brenda tried to sit up, but the weakness forced her back against the pillow. And when she finally asked what had happened, the answer did not come from her family. The door opened, and the doctor stepped in, followed by 2 officers who immediately shifted the air in the room. Their presence was firm, controlled, and impossible to ignore. They began asking questions without hesitation, moving from Brenda to the people around her, their tone steady but sharp enough to cut through any attempt to stay calm. What had she eaten? Who prepared the meals? Who had been closest to her over the past weeks? Her stepmother insisted everything had been normal, repeating that they all shared the same food, while her sister confirmed it with quiet certainty. Her father said very little, answering only when directly addressed, his voice even, his posture unchanged. Brenda listened, but something about the way each answer came too quickly, too smoothly, unsettled her more than the questions themselves. The officers exchanged brief looks before writing everything down, then explained that they would need to speak with each family member separately. The room shifted again, tension replacing the fragile calm that had been holding everything together. Brenda watched as they started with her brother, who had just arrived not long before, his expression already defensive, his frustration visible, even before anyone accused him of anything. He denied knowing anything, his voice rising as the questions continued. But the officers did not react, only noting every detail, every hesitation. Brenda could feel it building, not just the investigation, but something underneath it. Something that had been there long before she came back to that house, something that had never really gone away. As she lay there, unable to move, she realized this was no longer about what had happened to her body. It was about everything that had always been wrong inside that family, finally being dragged into the open whether anyone was ready for it or not. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the hospital shifted as more people began to show up. Brenda could hear voices in the hallway before the door even opened. Low at first, then sharper, carrying opinions that no one bothered to hide. Relatives she had not seen in years stepped inside, as if they had always been part of her life, their concern sounding rehearsed, their eyes scanning the room with something closer to curiosity than fear. They did not speak to her directly for long, and when they did, it felt brief and distant, like she was no longer the center of what had happened. The conversation turned quickly, almost naturally, toward finding someone to blame. It started with a single comment, quiet but pointed, suggesting that her brother had always been unpredictable, that he had made bad decisions before, that he had been under pressure lately. That was all it took. The room followed that direction, without resistance. Each voice adding another reason, another detail, building a narrative that felt too easy to accept. Her sister did not argue against it, only stood there with the same composed expression, allowing the assumption to grow without interruption. Her stepmother tried to calm things down, but her words lacked force, fading under the weight of everyone else's certainty. Her father remained silent again, watching everything unfold without stepping in, and that silence carried more meaning than any accusation spoken out loud. When the officers returned, they did not ignore what they were hearing. They asked her brother to step outside, their tone firm, leaving no room for refusal. He reacted immediately, his frustration turning into anger as he demanded to know why he was being singled out. But the answer did not come. The hallway swallowed their voices as the door closed behind them, and for a moment the room felt strangely lighter, as if removing him had solved something that no one had actually proven. Brenda lay there, listening to the shift in energy, noticing how quickly everyone adjusted, how easily suspicion had found a target. Time passed slowly until the door opened again, and her brother was brought back in. His expression changed, no longer defensive but colder, sharper, like something inside him had hardened. He did not look at anyone right away, not even her, and when he finally spoke, it was only to repeat that he had nothing to do with it. The officers did not confirm or deny anything, only stating that the questioning would continue, that they were not ruling anyone out. The attention in the room did not move away from him, and Brenda could feel the weight of it pressing down, not just on him, but on everything that had been building beneath the surface of that family for years, now exposed in a way that could not be undone. By the following evening, Brenda's thoughts had started moving in a direction no one else seemed to consider. The focus in the hospital had settled too quickly on her brother, and that certainty felt forced, almost convenient, as if everyone had chosen the easiest explanation instead of the right one. Lying there with too much time to think, she began sorting through the past few weeks in a different way. Not as a sequence of symptoms, but as a pattern of interactions. Moments that had seemed insignificant before, but now refused to stay quiet. One name kept surfacing, not because it was obvious, but because it didn't fit cleanly into anything else. Sean Whitaker. He was the only person outside the family who had regular access to her daily routine, someone who had been around often enough to go unnoticed, someone who knew her schedule without needing to ask. The memory of his behavior shifted under this new lens, small details sharpening into something harder to ignore. There had been conversations that ended too abruptly. Times when he had insisted on handling things himself. Moments where his attention felt less like concern and more like control. None of it had stood out before, but now it formed a line she couldn't unsee. When the officers returned, Brenda brought it up, carefully at first, then with more certainty, as she explained why it didn't feel random. They listened without interrupting, writing everything down, then asked specific questions about his movements, his proximity, the frequency of their interactions. The direction of the investigation adjusted almost immediately, shifting away from the tension inside the family and toward something external, something that seemed easier to isolate. Her sister supported the idea without hesitation, reinforcing the possibility with a calm confidence that made it sound almost reasonable, while her stepmother nodded along, relieved to see attention move elsewhere. Her father reacted differently, not openly dismissing it, but not engaging either, his silence returning in a way that felt heavier this time, as if he was waiting for something rather than responding to what was happening. The officers left soon after to follow up, and the room settled into a quieter state. But it was not the same kind of silence as before. This one carried expectation, a sense that the answer might be close, that everything could be resolved once the right person was identified. Hours passed, and when they finally returned, their expressions had changed just enough to shift the tone again. They confirmed they had spoken to Sean, checked his schedule, verified his whereabouts, and nothing they found supported the idea that he had been involved. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, nothing that placed him in a position to do what had been done. The explanation Brenda had built began to lose its shape, not collapsing all at once, but unraveling piece by piece, leaving behind the same unanswered question, only sharper now, more difficult to ignore. The focus did not return to where it had been before, but it didn't move forward either, suspended in a space where suspicion existed without direction, where every possibility felt incomplete. Brenda lay there, feeling that shift settle in, realizing that the truth was still inside that house, still within reach, just not where anyone had been willing to look yet. A day later, something in the way her brother carried himself began to feel different. When he entered the room, he no longer reacted to the looks or the tension that followed him. And, instead of defending himself, he stayed quiet, watching, as if he had decided that speaking too soon would only make things worse. Brenda noticed it immediately, the shift from frustration to focus, and it made her pay closer attention than she had before. He spent more time near her without saying much, observing the room, the people moving in and out, the routines that had formed since she had been admitted. It was subtle. At first, the way his eyes followed small details, others ignored, the way he seemed to be piecing something together instead of waiting for answers to be handed to him. Later that evening, when they were finally alone for a few minutes, he asked a question that didn't sound random. He wanted to know exactly what she had been eating and drinking in the days leading up to that night, not in general terms, but specifically, item by item, moment by moment. Brenda tried to recall it as clearly as she could, and as she spoke, the memories started aligning in a way she had not considered before. Most of it had been shared meals, the same plates, the same food, nothing that set her apart from anyone else at the table. But there was one detail that didn't match the rest. Something small that had felt normal at the time, repeated often enough to disappear into routine. Her father had been the one bringing her drinks. Not occasionally, not randomly, but consistently, almost every day since she had come back. Juice in the morning, something else in the evening, always placed in front of her with quiet insistence, always accompanied by a tone that left no space for refusal. At the time, it had seemed like an effort to be considerate, a gesture meant to smooth over years of distance without addressing them directly. Now, under a different light, it felt structured, deliberate in a way that unsettled her. Her brother didn't interrupt as she spoke, but his expression tightened slightly, confirming that he had noticed the same thing. He pointed out that no one else had been given anything separate, that everything shared had been taken from the same dishes, the same containers. But those drinks had been different, prepared out of sight, handed directly to her, never questioned. Brenda felt the realization settle in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a steady shift that made each memory heavier than the last. She could see it now, the pattern forming across days she had not paid attention to, the repetition that had seemed harmless before. Her brother leaned back slightly, his voice lower, when he finally spoke again, not making a direct accusation, but suggesting that they needed to look closer at what had been right in front of them the entire time. Brenda didn't respond immediately, her thoughts moving through everything she had tried not to revisit since coming back to that house, and for the first time, the idea that the answer might be closer than anyone expected didn't feel like a possibility. It felt like something they had already overlooked. That night, the house did not feel the same to him anymore. When her brother returned home, he did not move through it the way he used to, and instead of going straight to his room, he stayed downstairs, keeping the lights off, letting the silence settle around him as he listened. It was not a plan at first, just a decision not to ignore what had already started to make sense. And as the hours passed, the quiet of the house began to reveal things it had always hidden. He heard movement long after everyone should have been asleep. Slow footsteps crossing the floor, followed by the soft sound of a voice that did not belong to anyone speaking out loud during the day. He moved closer without making noise, stopping near the edge of the hallway where he could hear clearly without being seen. Her father was on the phone, his tone low but steady, not worried, not rushed. Moshed. Just controlled in a way that made every word sound intentional. At first, the conversation seemed incomplete, fragments that didn't connect. But then a sentence cut through everything else and stayed there. He said she should never have come back. The words were not emotional, not angry, just final, like a decision that had already been made. Her brother felt something shift immediately, and, without thinking further, he took out his phone and started recording, holding it still, not trusting himself to move. The conversation continued, revealing more than it tried to hide, references to time, to attempts that had not worked as expected, to a need to finish what had already been started. There was no confusion in the way he spoke, no hesitation, nothing that suggested doubt. When the call ended, the house returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. Her brother stayed where he was for a moment longer, making sure there was no movement, then stepped back carefully, his mind already moving ahead of everything he had just heard. By the time he reached his room, the recording was still in his hand, and he replayed it once, just enough to confirm that he had not misunderstood anything. The voice was clear, every word sharp enough to remove any remaining uncertainty. The next morning, when he arrived at the hospital, he did not wait, did not try to ease into the conversation, and instead handed the phone directly to Brenda without explaining what it contained. She pressed play, expecting something unclear, something that would require interpretation, but what she heard left no space for doubt. Her father's voice filled the small space between them, calm, measured, unmistakable, speaking about her as if she were a problem that needed to be resolved. Brenda did not react immediately, her expression still as the recording ended, but the weight of it settled in a way that could not be undone, replacing every remaining question with something far more difficult to face. That same evening, Brenda returned to the house she had once tried to forget. The air inside felt unchanged, but the meaning of everything around her had shifted completely, and as she stepped into the living room, she saw her father sitting exactly where he always had, calm, composed, as if nothing had been exposed. Her stepmother stood nearby, confused by the tension that followed Brenda through the door, while her sister watched in silence, her expression unreadable, no longer in control of the narrative, the way she had been before. Brenda did not hesitate or soften the moment, and instead of asking questions, she handed the phone over, letting the recording speak before anyone could interrupt. The sound filled the room, steady and undeniable, and when it ended, no one moved. Her father did not react immediately, not with denial, not with anger, but with a stillness that confirmed more than any explanation could. When he finally spoke, his carried none of the restraint he had shown before, and what came out was not an excuse, but a release of something that had been buried for years. He admitted that he had never wanted her to come back, that her return had disrupted everything he had rebuilt, everything he believed should have belonged to someone else. He spoke about her as if she had always been separate from the family, as if she had been an obligation rather than a daughter, someone tolerated only until she left on her own. The resentment did not start recently, and it did not come from a single event, but from years of comparison, years of seeing her as less than the sister who had always been favored, the one who fit the image he wanted to protect. He described her independence as defiance, her absence as abandonment, twisting every choice she had made into something that justified the distance he had already created. Brenda stood there listening, not interrupting, not reacting in the way he might have expected, because what he was saying no longer surprised her. It only confirmed what had always been there beneath everything else. When he finished, the room remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt final. Brenda stepped forward slightly, her voice steady, when she finally responded, not raised, not emotional, just clear, in a way that left no space for misunderstanding. She told him that whatever connection had existed between them was over, not because of what he had done in that moment, but because it had never truly existed in the way it should have. Her stepmother tried to speak, her words breaking under the weight of what had just been revealed, while her sister remained still, unable or unwilling to step in, now that the truth no longer favored her position. Her brother stood closer to Brenda, not saying anything, but making it clear where he stood. Within hours, the situation moved beyond the house and into something formal, as the recording was handed over, and the process that followed did not leave room for negotiation or reversal. Her father was taken into custody without resistance, his silence returning as everything he had tried to control slipped out of his reach. Brenda did not stay to watch what came next, and as she walked away from that house, she did not look back, Not because she was trying to forget, but because there was nothing left worth holding on to. What remained was not anger or regret, but a clarity she had never allowed herself before. The understanding that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you have to leave behind completely. And if there was anything she carried forward from all of it, it was this: that distance is not always loss. And walking away can be the only way to survive what was never meant to keep you safe in the first place.